If love hid more chasms than promises, if, in the gap between two silences, an ancient shadow advanced patiently, corroding everything that once seemed solid, there was in him the appearance of light, a gentle brightness that invited trust, but beneath the surface a murmur of old wood creaking under invisible weight. Memory, promise, death, and destiny intertwined like roots beneath the floor of an old house. On the threshold of a locked door, the air shifted. One step and everything that had been hidden drew a breath. No return. The dawn spilled a watery pallor over the mansion, and the cold seemed to work through the walls like a living organism, tightening crevices, testing hinges, brushing against the heavy drapery. She awoke before the first bird, with the clarity of one who senses something has shifted a millimeter beyond what is bearable. His steady breathing beside her maintained the semblance of order, but Time's skin was already trembling. The body motionless under the sheet, the weight of sleep feigning peace, and a trace of night glued to the corner of the room like the memory of an extinguished fire. The main corridor stretched like an ancient artery, carrying echoes instead of blood. The hardwood floor responded to footsteps with resistance, as if each plank remembered names, dates, absences. On the walls, portraits housed eyes that followed her with secular patience. The house smelled of books that had given up being read, of flowers pressed between pages, and of rusted metal refusing to yield. Light, when it arrived, positioned itself in timid beams, as one who asks permission to exist. She approached the tall window and saw the valley iron gray in the mist. Trees stood silent, noting the murmur of wind. Below, a dirt path ran like a scar, curving toward an iron gate that, though still, seemed to emit a barely audible creak. The outside world felt suspended, as if waiting for the slightest gesture to unwind the tapestry of hidden events. The mansion, of stone and shadow, had been his long before she arrived. The paperwork, the inventory, the keys, the cluster of small habits that bind a house to its owner, all was ready when her life shifted toward that address. What was not ready was what preceded it, what he kept in darkness out of courtesy or cowardice, not an absence but a layered fullness, a past he preferred to pretend ended where a convenient version began. Their meeting was born of coincidence that, from afar, looked like destiny. The nearby town, small enough for every corner to know every face, held a fair of old objects, yellowed memories available to anyone needing a story to fill interior gaps. He learned to move among those remnants with a kind of reverence. She, weary of loud noise and surface promises, approached silence as one approaches cold water. The promise of possible rest brought them to the same wooden table, the same ornate photograph frame, the same gesture of consent to what they called future. In the early months, the house accepted her presence with something like gratitude. Damp cloths climbed its surfaces, removing opacity that stubbornly remained. Windows received wipes and brushes, and the panes, even broken in some corner, allowed obedient light to pass. Rugs were beaten, dislodging dust that served as domestic fog for hours. The library recognized fresh fingers across old spines. The fireplace resumed breath. At night, when wind carved gentle curves among trees, the warmth of flames reshaped the contours of the rooms, as though the house remembered how to be refuge. But it did not take long for small variations to introduce an arrhythmia in what passed for stability. On certain days, the desk drawer that should have been empty held the discreet volume of recently rearranged papers. On certain dawns, the corridor returned to the ear the impression of footsteps no one took. On certain mornings, a key hung from a nail that had not existed the day before. A mirror in a curve of the second-floor hall returned not an image but a sensation, as if the polished surface carried magnetism, and held alive a memory the conscience tried to erase. The precision with which he avoided certain rooms had the seriousness of one who learned to live with traps without dismantling them. The old wing, up high, remained closed under the excuse that the wood could not bear weight, that the ceiling required repair, that there was nothing there but junk long claimed by time. Yet there was, in the gesture he used to deflect the matter, a brief tremor that betrays truths the body's structure tries to guard. That tremor, seen with the delicacy of one observing a glass in window light, said more than words, and it grew inside her like a root that finds moisture and decides to dig deeper. In the library, shelves displayed variations of dust. Some books seemed never to have been touched. Others, despite the dust, showed worn edges, as if impatient fingers opened them in the middle of night and closed them before dawn. Between two hardback volumes lay a letter folded on itself, inside an envelope without sender, where ink had sunk into the fiber of paper under years' weight. The paper spoke of regret and restitution, of protection and price, of promise and silence. The slanted handwriting returned to the reading the breath of someone very tired. At the end there was no signature, only two initials which served more to confuse than to guide. The letter lodged itself in her memory like an invisible shard of glass. Routine continued, but under a different light. Coffee lost its depth. His footsteps in the corridor began to mark time with unnerving precision. The valley outside seemed deeper. The drapes weighed more than the fabric should allow. The house recorded everything. When winter settled in with force, the mansion contracted its stone muscles, and every wooden joint warned it would endure as best it could. Wind found gaps and learned to pronounce certain names with the cut of its cold blades. The stained glass sweated moisture in late dawn. Corridors held frost at doorknobs. In the midst of that scene, a picture frame, previously balanced, fell to the floor and shattered with a delicate, splintered apology, as if it regretted exposing something ahead of its time. From behind the photograph, like some forgotten skin peeling, a small, very folded paper fell, with the signature she knew so well. The paper contained few lines, but in them enough density to alter the weight of the rooms. The house tilted a degree. The world did not collapse, but something shifted. Perception adjusted as if an object on a slightly tilted table. The rest of the day was spent in minimal tasks executed with the care one uses to cross cracked floorboards. At nightfall, the fire in the hearth crackled as though deciphering a secret language. Her eyes followed embers, translating snaps into portents. The next morning, he left before starlight faded from the vitrals. A decision rose in her chest without sound or fanfare. The old wing, always denied, awaited. The stairs accepted her passage with a moan. The forbidden hallway smelled of ancient dust, of stored fabrics, of paint that had abandoned adhesion. Under a pale sheet lay the shape of an old desk waiting. The cloth resisted for a split second, then gave way, revealing dark wood, circular rings of cups, scratches, stain marks. In its drawers, letters slept in resigned order. Envelopes bore initials, dates without decades, torn stamps. Among paper blades, a photograph survived the rot. A young woman stared at something the frame did not show. There was firmness in her face and a kind of cold shock in her eyes, as if forced to learn statue posture without surrendering inner muscles. The frame, cracked in a corner, let the image breathe through a narrow gap, returning to the room a moist plea. The brooch's stone pinned to the collar of the dark dress. Light, oblique, touched the metal but refused reflection. The chest, leaning against the baseboard, bore chains no one habitually removed. The padlock, worn by time, offered weak resistance. Its lid consented to open with the sound of old membrane tearing. Inside, the catalog of the unsaid, newspaper clippings about a premature death, the formal death certificate solving by one word a complex set of circumstances, notes of times, proper names the house never mentioned, a hand-drawn map of city streets with a circle in ink, a receipt lacking stamp, photographs cut in half as if someone meant to separate people by violence of scissors. The brooch, identical to that in the photo, rested there, cold, heavy, incriminating. His silhouette filled the doorway before footsteps spoke. Light rarefied around them. The body she loved crossed it slowly, as one who already knows what will be found. The air solidified around the objects on the desk. There were no words, and silence in that house already knew all the functions of language. Truth, when finally accepted, does not arrive as novelty, but as an adjustment. He belonged to a story beneath the very story, and in that lower layer there was a death that required arrangement, a pain no one knew how to handle, a crime of omission that perpetuated itself in diverted documents, bought witnesses, manipulated records. The woman in the photograph held a central place in that nucleus. She was close kin, a direct responsibility, the continuity that guilt had needed to amputate. The official version commanded the chaos under label of fatality. What in fact had happened, however, required the word's choice, and choice demanded the word cost. The revelation did not come as total confession, but as the withdrawal of a cloth covering half of a piece of furniture, enough to recognize the form, insufficient to measure the volume. The part revealed, however, proved enough to reorganize the tide within her. Love, until then accustomed to sailing over calm surface, found itself with the swell of a more honest sea. It was not the end, but no longer the beginning. She descended from the old wing with the brooch in hand, and the corridor's temperature changed, as though the metal bore its own climate. The restored sister's portrait placed on the sideboard reconstructed the absent face of the house. The envelope with his handwriting burned invisibly in her coat pocket, radiating a heat that warmed nothing. The mansion kept functioning, pushing the hands of an invisible clock, maintaining the liturgy of creaks, generating drafts in ill-sealed windows. Everything same and everything different. The days that followed unfolded like fabric losing its stretch. The routine persisted out of inertia. The bed made in the morning, cups washed, books gathered. The garden, in its survival discipline, positioned leaves against the wind. But below the appearance, a kind of hunger. Her body, accustomed to observing small signs, began noting invisible microfractures. His hand taking one extra second to pull away from a surface. The head turning discreetly when crossing the portrait's corridor. Lingering before the window of the office overlooking the iron gate. Altered breath on the step approaching the forbidden wing. Things unsaid acquired specific weight, and the house, sensitive to weight, creaked. She began writing. Not to show him, not to accuse, but not to forget. She put on paper what she saw, what she felt, the names, the dates, times. It was her map of painful vigilance. And one night she received an anonymous letter, something common in the town when someone digs too deep into the past, saying she was unearthing stones too old because in them are insects that bite without being seen. The words trembled with hidden threat. There are truths that kill more than weapons. She placed the letter beside the brooch, shut the desk window, lit a candle, and the night sound became a tapestry of dread. He noticed, or pretended to notice, that control was slipping. His eyes observed her pocket, the objects she handled, the papers she read. In a gesture of protection or fear, he relocated a drawer into the main wardrobe, attempted to rearrange photos, rearrange the portrait, cover tracks. But what had been revealed had already left invisible marks. The tone of his voice, the insect of hesitation in his steps, the way he avoided being touched by direct sunlight that seemed to illuminate surfaces of guilt-guarding items. At night in the bedroom, she felt his presence as weight, as shadow projected against the gloom. She pressed her ear to the door, heard his breathing, not as calm as he claimed, and at times imagined him crying, though the sound was hidden behind wood, behind silence. She sensed he fought something strong, internal boundaries, the need to apologize, to confess, to be freed from a lie he had held for so long. At a certain point, she wanted to leave, not to escape, but to force the moment of truth. She packed silently, just what was necessary, looked one last time at the woman's portrait, at the brooch, at the scattered papers. There was love there, yes, but also cracks. And if love did not resist transparency, then maybe she must redefine love itself, but she did not leave. Because leaving demands rupture, demands abandonment, demands accepting that what one once believed eternal may have been only a promise's shadow. And also because in abandonment there would be uncharted territory, where guilt, memory, and silence would have no end. Then she confronted him, at the threshold of a corridor, between the oblique light of stained glass and the echo of old chains. She did not accuse. Her steps spoke. She raised the brooch in her hand, the envelope in her pocket, the portrait by her side, and asked, not in voice but with the weight of all she already discovered, if he still believed that she should love a man so divided, if he still held that truth could be kept hidden to protect who one loves. He faltered. His silence in response was clearer than any explanation. The air compressed, and there, between partial light and thick shadow, she saw that full revelation does not come only through spoken word, but through his decision to remain there, vulnerable, or to leave. And that love, if it was to remain, would demand that he abandon forever the construction of silence. She awoke that morning knowing nothing could remain as before. The air felt saturated, heavy with the promise of truth still unclaimed. He was not in the room. Curtains swayed. Sunlight pulsed through stained glass panes, casting spots on the carpet that had once seemed mere decoration, now warnings. In the main hall, she found him standing by the window overlooking the valley. He held the brooch in hand, the object that had set everything in motion. Her sister's portrait, partially restored with its glass replaced, hung on the wall as a mute witness. Official papers lay spread on the table. Death certificates, photographs, newspaper clippings, old correspondence. The past filled the space between them, etched into the corners of time-worn frames. She entered unannounced. The carpet muted her step. The echo of furniture creaked beneath her. The hearth's flames flickered, projecting uncertain light over them both. He turned, shoulders squared, face worn. Something in his eyes begged for mercy, not so much for himself, but for all he had hidden over so many years. She lifted the brooch between her fingers, observing the glint of its dark stone catching tiny sparks of light. It was like holding a live ember of guilt. He made a gesture, hesitated, guilt trembling in his hands. He laid out on the table the true death certificate, contradicting the official version. Witness statements, photos, letters of contrition all gathered there, exposed. The whole truth rushed in like a river bursting dams. He confessed altering records, suppressing evidence, paying for silence, erasing the very existence of his sister, so that she would not be blamed, so that the world would never ask, out of shame, out of fear, out of twisted love. He admitted believing he was protecting her, thinking he was sparing her, but discovered with pain that protection is not erasure, that love that erases lies becomes part of the lie. She felt her body buckle under the burden of revelation, as if the ground quivered. All she had built, believed, hoped was there. Love, promises, but also voids. Trust, a delicate flower, wilting, and yet something in her rose with clarity. Lies could not smother it. A moment of irrevocable decision came. He looked at her, eyes moist, voice hoarse from holding worlds inside. Which would he choose? Continue living under conveniently silent lies, or face the world with truth even knowing love might shatter? Rejection or loss were real possibilities. She, exhausted, brooch in her hand, inhaled deeply, let the silence stretch across them a few heartbeat-distant seconds, recognized his guilt, recognized his anguish, recognized also her own wound, not only from what was hidden, but from years living amid the unspoken. She chose not to leave. Because there was, even among tons of deceit, something more powerful. Truth, once admitted, liberates. She chose to forgive. Not the indisputable wrongdoing, but the man in all his brokenness and fear. Forgiveness, not as erasure, but acceptance. That making amends, repairing, rebuilding would be a painful path, but a possible one. He knelt, as though seeking solace. He placed on the hearth the envelope with the promise never kept. Allowed the letter she had read so long ago to remain exposed to the hearth's dim glow, to burn, not to erase what had happened, but to symbolize that from then on, he would hide no more. The house trembled as if sharing that sacrifice. Every locked door he would open from that point on, every document he would reveal, every time he allowed someone to see what had been hidden, would be living scars. They marked, but they healed. The days that followed brought tangible consequences. Neighbors watched. Authorities reviewed records. Relatives of the buried woman demanded answers. Enrique faced public shame, legal jolts, resurfacing of old accusations. Elisa stood by his side, but not as hostage to his pain, as witness to his decision to become whole even in the gaze of the world. Love between them changed. No longer a radiant promise, but work of reconstruction. Trust rebuilt not through perfection, but through honesty, through visible remorse, through small gestures, keeping the old wing permanently open, allowing her to sift through documents, admitting the days he fled. He never forgot the glances, the late steps, the silent tears he heard while she read letters in the attic. She never stopped asking, doubting, remembering. But she learned that remembering and loving can coexist, that the past need not rule the present, so long as it is known and accepted. In the end, on a calm morning, the valley flooded with pale light. She opened a window. The cold air brought scent of rain, scent of damp earth. Enrique appeared beside her, lifted his hand to hers, hesitated. Their fingers intertwined in a small gesture, but heavy with all that had been broken and rebuilt. The brooch hung between them as witness, not anymore a symbol of lies, but remembrance of the pain overcome. She looked toward the misted horizon, not with childish hope, but with serene lucidity. He looked at her, offering no grand promises but truth in his eyes. They knew that love from then on would demand constant transparency, acceptance of imperfection, and that some wounds never fully close. But also knew that if they would walk together, the path ahead would be paved not with shadows but with the courage to face the light.